What's up, TC? How you feeling this morning? You alive? You well? Appreciate the woods. So glad that you're here this morning. My name is Justin Chandler. I'm one of the pastors here at the Crossing. So glad that you took a part of your morning to hang out here with us. As you've seen from some of the graphics on the screen and what you can see on your little handout, we're in the middle of this series called Marked, where we've been studying through the Gospel of Mark and the story of Jesus. And in particular, we've been looking at the stories of people who they encountered Jesus, and he left a mark upon their lives. And so if you're joining us for the first time today, or maybe you've missed a couple of weeks, or now that we're weeks in, you're like, man, I could use a fresh recap. I got you this morning. So what we're going to do is just kind of look at all the ground that we've covered so far, because what we're talking about today is the most important moment in human history. And as we start to cover some of those chapters, each step becomes more and more important. And so I want to highlight the steps we've taken so far. So in week one, we talked about how Jesus began his time here on the earth and began teaching. And he called a group of men to follow him, 12 men in particular. And they become known as the disciples and the apostles. And what Jesus did is he marked each one of their lives. And what we started to see is that a marked life will pour itself out for others, not only in the life of Jesus, but in the life of each of the men who followed Jesus, that as he left his mark upon them, they too wanted to leave their mark upon others. In week two, we talked about a man who had a crippled hand and how everyone in society had ostracized him. Everyone in society had kicked him out. He had been pushed to the side. And yet as he encountered Jesus, Jesus didn't have that response. Jesus asked him to stretch out his hand, and in doing so, that man was healed. And what we talked about that week is that spiritual, emotional, and physical healing is available to us when we give our lives to Jesus. And we had a moment here at the front and at the top where people were able to receive that same spiritual, emotional, and physical healing in their lives that weekend. During the next one, we talked about Jesus sitting on a boat, and he had fallen asleep. And as they were riding in the boat at night, that there was this storm that began to overwhelm the boat, and his friends became really nervous, thinking that they would die. And so they went to wake up Jesus, who was sleeping during the storm, and they said, "Don't you care if we live or die?" Jesus woke up from his nap, said, "Stop it," to the storm. The storm stopped. And then I like to imagine that Jesus just went right back to bed. Right? Like it was just this, "Stop it," and then now going back to sleep. And as he calmed the storm, one of the things we talked about that day is each one of us is going to encounter the same thing. It may not be a literal storm on a sea, but each one of us is going to encounter storms on our life. And we serve a God who loves us and who we can trust in the middle of our storms. During the next week, we had Halloween weekend, and if you joined us for that week, you were met by a surprise when we opened the service, and Tim began to sing "This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine." Now, not being a vocalist, I'm not at all gonna enter into that space, but apparently I can jump into the Christmas choir because the only requirement is age. So since I can sing Tim's "This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine," and what he brought out for each one of us is that our identity can get wrapped up into so many things. And if we're not careful, our culture is going to push us to become busier and busier to find our identity in something else. But what we determined that day is that our identity is not found in our activity, but our identity is found in light of what Jesus has done for each one of us. The next week, we celebrated as over 50 people said yes and were baptized here at our church. They were baptized up here at the front. And it was one of the really, really cool services. But what was cool about it is we started by saying each one of us is going to have a choice as to how receptive we're going to be to the message of Jesus. Each one of us gets to choose when we hear something how we're going to respond. And so we invited people that day that if you'd like to respond to the message of Jesus today, that you could. And there was almost 60 people who said yes during that weekend, and we had a chance to celebrate with them. And then last week, we talked about James and John, two of Jesus' friends. And they thought the pathway to greatness was in pride, was in their achievement, was in what they did. But Tim shared with us that the pathway to greatness is never found in pride or in achievement, but our path to greatness is found in our humility. And so as we begin in Mark chapter 11, every step Jesus takes as he enters into Jerusalem is one step closer to him being on the cross, one step closer to him dying his death. Now, I don't know how you walked in today. I don't know if you're new to the Crossing, you're new to church, Jesus, the Bible. But no matter what we think and feel about that, the reality is that the life and death of Jesus has been recorded in history, both by his friends and by historians who just heard the stories of him. So we have a literal man named Jesus who literally died by the hands of a Jewish court and a Roman governor. Now, what happens after that, it's going to be the determination of you and I, what we're going to do with it. But regardless of what you think about Jesus, the reality today is that the life and death of Jesus has marked human history forever. You've got this guy who was born in a barn amongst animals. He didn't have a home. He didn't have money. He didn't conquer any armies. He didn't create some specific invention. He didn't name a city after himself. He didn't have this grandiose way in which he lived that made him one of the most significant people ever. No, you have a guy who taught for a couple of years in a small state in Rome, and yet in a matter of years, it's literally turned the entire Roman Empire upside down. And you could say, all right, that's true, and that's nice as it is, but then we could say that he's marked history because every indication about his life would be that we would forget him. Like if that's all his story was, we would say, then how come Jesus hasn't been forgotten like everybody else who lived like he did? What we see is like even right now, time is divided before his birth, and we're living in the years after it. We're 2017 years away from when Jesus was born. The same guy who history should have forgotten. And then we could say that look at his friends, the 12 friends who saw him live and saw him die. Those 12 friends made it their mission that they were going to let the world know about it. Not just some guy who died, they believed who came back to life again. And they lived their lives in such a way that very soon the entire Roman Empire and the religious landscape had been turned upside down by their lives and the story of Jesus. And so what we can find as we sit into the room today, again, you may not believe that about Jesus. You may not believe that about him being God on the planet, but there's been no person and no event that has marked human history the way that this man and this event has. And so as we enter into this morning, we are going to dialogue about the most important event in human history. And we're going to talk about its impact not only on these men, but on us as well. But before we get there, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the person next to you, right? Look them right in the eyes. So some of you may not feel like participating this early. It's 9:50. Go ahead and stretch out a little bit. Take a yawn. I want you to look at your neighbor. I want you to look them right in the face. And I want you to point your finger right in their face, right? Everybody at the same time. I want you to point your finger right in the face. And I want you to say, you. All right, look them right in the eyes and go, you. All the energy, all you muster, you. All right, now I want you to look to your second neighbor, the person you picked number 2. All right, don't make it awkward. All right, but I want you to look them right in the face. And you've got some left in you, I know. It's still 9:50, but look them right in the eyeballs and just go, you. All right? Now here's what I want you to do. You get one more. I want you to take your finger. I want you to point it right at me. Right, and I want you to just like look me right in the face, right? You're like, you tall Scandinavian man, you just like right in the face. And then I want you to go, you. And as you point your finger, here's what I want you to notice. This one, as you pointed at me, that you've got 3 more fingers pointing back at you. Uh-oh. And now every time you point the finger at somebody, no matter what you say, every time you point the finger at someone, you've got 3 more fingers pointing back at you. And that's what I want you to remember today. If you forget everything else, that there's 3 more that point back at you, these 3. So here's what we're going to do today. The story of Jesus highlights so many people. I mean, as he walks towards the cross, literally every step, every paragraph, every section is just amplified in intensity with the people that Jesus marks. But today I want us to look at 3 people, and 3 people that we could say, I would never do that. Like, I would never do what that guy did. And yet, if we're honest with ourselves, we find that not only would we, but that we already have. So the first person we're going to talk about today, his name is Judas. Judas Iscariot. Now, Judas is infamous in history because of what he did to Jesus. Infamous. Like, when was the last time you met a kid named Judas? You haven't, because of what happens here, right? That this is one of those moments that forever changed the way people name their children because of what happened with Judas. Now, you think of Brutus, Judas, and Benedict Arnold. Like, those are the people, when you think of betrayal, you think of them. And what happened with Judas is the thing we have to remember is everything we've covered so far in the story of Mark and in the gospel of Jesus, everything we see, Judas was a part of all that. Like, he saw Jesus wake up from bed and say, stop, to a storm. He saw Jesus walk on water. He saw Jesus feed 5,000 people with a kid's lunch. He saw Jesus heal people of disease, of not being able to speak. He saw Jesus get people up out of their bed and have them walk again. Judas saw Jesus raise somebody from the dead, right? So it's not this ignorant guy who's like, oh, I don't really know. It was one of Jesus' closest friends who saw all of it and yet made this decision. And what we see leading into this story is that there was something alive inside of Judas that was more than how much he loved Jesus. And so we're going to begin in Mark chapter 14, verses 3-4. And this is where we start to see this unravel for Judas. We'll throw it up on the screen for you. It says this. So while Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured this perfume on his head. Now, some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume?" Now, I don't know the last time you said something indignantly, right? But it's probably not one of those things that you think or recall yourself doing. And so here's what I love is one of Jesus' other friends, his name's John, he wrote down this same story and he helps to highlight it for us a little more. So he says this, "But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, 'Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it." So it'd be easy when we're listening to Judas for him to say, "Man, we should have sold this. There's so many poor people. Look how many people we could have helped with this." What we see about Judas is it wasn't that he loved the poor, but that Judas loved money. And he used to steal money from Jesus, the very same guy who didn't have any money. But as he was holding the money bag, he would help himself to some. And we see that as that lived in Judas, it then spiraled into this event, which is the one that we recorded. So Judas, one of the 12, went to the chief priest to betray Jesus to them. And they were delighted to hear this. And then check this out. And they promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Now, not long after this, Jesus is at a table eating with his other friends as Judas is left. And as he's eating, he decides that night, "Hey, I want to go to the garden to pray." And as he walks out to the garden, Judas then walks to the chief priest and hands him over to be betrayed. And this moment now, what we're about to read, this is why no one names their kid Judas for what we're about to read here. So here's what it says in verse 43. "So just as Jesus was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. 'The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard.' Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, 'Rabbi,' and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting his ear off. 'Am I leading a rebellion,' said Jesus, 'that you have come out with a sword and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled.' Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." Now, I love the Gospel of Mark, and I love the way that it records the very end because of that last verse that we just read. Now, there's a guy who's a friend of Jesus, and when Jesus gets captured, everybody else runs away. But one of his boys got caught up, and rather than getting caught, rather than getting turned in, my man just unraveled out of his clothes and ran away naked. Now, we could think historically like, oh, maybe Jesus was the only person in the garden. It was just him and his friends. I mean, a mob just showed up. Odds are there was a guy who was taking his girl out for the first time that night. And as they were walking around the garden together, they saw the mob, had no idea what it was about, and then you just saw your boy just running through the forest. Like, not today. And so we've got all that. And that just intrigues me because this is history, and then somebody got etched forever as the guy who was like willing to leave clothes and all. And so here we see Judas, and he takes Jesus in. And that's this thing that's alive in him, this part in his heart that he could see all the things that Jesus did. He could be a part of all of the experiences. He could have all of the encounters, see all the ways that Jesus moved. And yet, Judas loved money more than he loved Jesus. And we can look at Judas and we could say, man, I would never do that, right? We could point the finger right at him and say, there's no way I would make that decision. And yet, if we're honest, we see all the time that there's this thing that we love, and yet we're willing to do something that's far less, and we'll sacrifice that thing that we love. We see it in people's marriages and their relationships and their jobs and their finances. We see these moments where people are willing to sacrifice the thing they love most in order to have this temporary thing that they just can't get away from. And here's Judas saying, I love Jesus, and yet because he loved money more, he was willing to give up his best friend. And I could look at Judas and say, man, like money's not that appealing to me, or money wouldn't ever grab my heart like that. But if I'm honest with you, I realize today that Judas lives in me too. That there's things in my heart that if I'm not careful of, if I'm not in control of, that thing could try to grab hold of every aspect of my heart and try to yank away the things I love most. Because I realize Judas is alive in me. And so I could say, not me, not today, not ever. And yet you and I know plenty of people who have been willing to walk down that same road. And so what it says about Judas is that he was so racked with guilt, he was so racked with shame that he ended up taking his own life. And in this moment where Jesus is betrayed, you see this line that he says, so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Because Jesus knew something that you and I didn't, that even Judas himself didn't know. Jesus knew that the Father would have to treat him like Judas so that he could treat Judas like Jesus. The reality is that Jesus would have forgiven Judas, because we see not too long ago, the next character we're going to talk about, his name's Peter. We see that Jesus is willing to forgive him. And so if Jesus is willing to forgive Judas for what he's done, if Jesus is willing to forgive Peter for what he's done, then surely Jesus would be able to forgive us. You've got a guy who's just saying, my guilt and my shame has overrun my life, so I'm willing to take it by my own hands. And we see in Peter, there's a guy who's willing to give all of that to Jesus and to lay his life down. So the next character we have today, his name is Peter. Peter's just like Judas. He saw all of the same things. He was a part of all of the same experiences. He walked on all the same roads. But Peter was one of those guys who, when Jesus said, hey, this is going to happen, this moment where everybody runs away, where everybody quits, when this happens, everyone's going to leave me. And Peter was one of those guys who was like, I'm not going out like that. Like Peter was the guy who didn't even know what was going to happen, but said, not me. And here's what we see in Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 27. You will all fall away, Jesus told them. But Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. The very same others who, as soon as Jesus was captured, they all fled. The very same others who were like, we will die tonight, in a few short hours are going to be the ones who leave Jesus all alone. And what we see from Peter, it continues in verse 66. We see the ways in which Peter was willing to disown and deny his relationship with Jesus. It says, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. And again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you're a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words that Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So Peter has this moment where he sees Judas betray Jesus. He sees a mob take Jesus away and lead him into a Jewish court. He sees the Jewish court beat and ridicule and mock Jesus. And here Peter is in this moment where he's standing before Jesus' death, and he's just seen one of his friends sell him out. And Peter has said emphatically, I'm never going to do that. Peter has said emphatically, even if I have to die, I will. So then a young girl comes up to him and says, surely you know this guy named Jesus. He's like, I don't know him at all. And then again she returns and she's like, man, but you got to know him. You do, right? And he's like, I don't know him at all. And then she gets together a small crowd, and as they come to him and they're like, you know him because you're from his same area. You're from his same town. Like, you have to be one of his friends. And he begins to like call curses on himself. It's one of those moments where he's like, if I'm lying, then you can ... Right? He puts all of his cards into, I don't know him. And then there's that moment where he remembers the way in which Jesus told him, man, before the rooster cries twice, you're going to do this. And it'd be easy for us to point the finger at Peter, right? It'd be easy for us to say, man, I would never deny my relationship with somebody with that. I would never be able to stand in front of a group of people and say, I don't know them, man. But if you're honest and if I'm honest, I realize Peter lives in me too. There's been moments that I've had a relationship with a person that I've denied knowing them, or I've said, well, they're not really my friends. I mean, we're like loose acquaintances. We're not that close. I've had these moments where the impact that I don't want to be associated with them for various reasons. And then we could roll this conversation up to faith. Most people would say conversations about faith are the most difficult conversation that they would ever have. That even before the words start coming out, like they just start feeling this tightness in their throat and they just can't seem to get the words out. And as we go to like Thanksgiving this week, I don't think any of us are thinking, man, I'm going to load my plate up. I'm going to sit down at the table and I'm just going to say, who wants to talk about Jesus now, huh? Right? Like none of us are anticipating that. And so we could even see that it may be connected with the relationships that we have here on the planet, or it could be connected with our relationship with Jesus. That there's many moments where you and I are willing to deny our connection to a person because of the impact it would have on our life. Now for Peter, it wasn't like being socially ostracized or people saying, well, we don't like you anymore. For Peter, he was looking at the way in which Jesus was just beaten, and now he's heading off to a cross. Peter said, I don't want to die like that. Like, I don't want to walk the same road he's walking. It was a literal death. Whereas for us, we could potentially say, I could face relational death because I'm going to have this. Man, Peter had far greater consequences and said, I don't want to do that. And yet, Jesus knew something that you and I didn't. See, Jesus knew the Father would have to treat Jesus like Peter so that he could treat Peter like Jesus. Not too long later in this story, Jesus' friends will record that he came out of the tomb alive. And what we see is there's a moment where all the friends are back on the boat, and one of them says, look, there's Jesus on the shore. And Peter jumps out of his boat and starts swimming, leaving the rest of his friends to paddle the boat back in. And as Peter swims his way to the shore, there's a conversation between Jesus and Peter, and Jesus looks Peter in the face and says, do you love me? And Peter says, I love you. And Jesus says, do you love me? And Peter says, I love you. And he's like, do you love me? And he's like, you know that I love you. Bring in full circle this moment where he denied, and he denied. And now he said, I love, I love, I love. Man, if you've ever denied somebody, if you've ever been denied, Jesus knows what that's like, and he stood in your place. And what we see about Peter is Peter's so willing to give his life to Jesus that at the end of it, the Romans capture him and they're going to kill him. And in order to mock him, they want to kill him the same way that Jesus died. You follow this Jesus, you're going to die just like Jesus. And what Peter said, it's recorded in history, he said, I'm not willing to die in the same way that Jesus did. And so what the Romans did is they crucified him upside down because he said he wasn't worthy to bear the same death that Jesus had. So you've got in Judas, somebody who carries such guilt and such shame that they can't let go of. And instead, they take their own life. And in Peter, you have someone who faced guilt and shame and gave it freely to God. And as God took that guilt and took that shame, that they were willing to lay their own life down. And now the third character, he's a little less known. He's a little less infamous, but he's unbelievably notorious. His name is Barabbas. Now, some of you could read that and think like Barbasol, right? That's immediately where our brain goes, but his name is pronounced Barabbas. And as Jesus is led from the Jewish courts, he's brought to the Roman governor who rules in the area, and they'll need his permission in order to kill him. So as he stands before this guy named Pilate, Pilate's just grilling him with questions. And what we see about Jesus is Jesus isn't going to get caught up in some odd question. Like he has this way of ducking and diving every time someone tries to catch him. And what we see from one of the most powerful men in the world is it says that even Pilate was amazed because of Jesus. Again, a guy who had just been beaten is now standing in front of him. Pilate's response was he was amazed. So what happens is Jesus is led out onto this stage, and this is the moment in which we meet Barabbas. It begins in Mark 15. So it says, now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowds, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, we don't know a lot about Barabbas coming into it, and we don't know a lot about his story after it. But what we can guess from the story is we see Barabbas and Jesus essentially meet for the first time on a stage in which one of them is going to be chosen to die. And so here walks Barabbas, right? He led a riot and he murdered some people, potentially some of the family of the people that are in the crowd. And as Barabbas walks up, then you've got Jesus, the guy who taught, fed, and healed people. Insurrectionist, rioter, murderer, teacher, and feeder. And so what people would say is Barabbas was brought out on purpose because no reasonable person would choose Barabbas. And there's nobody who was thinking like, yeah, give us the murderer back. We'd love him, right? Whereas Jesus is standing here having done nothing, and they're like, no, we should kill that guy, right? And you can even see Pilate is saying, why do you want him to die? Like, what good has he done? And the crowd just wouldn't have any of it. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And we don't know what happens to Barabbas, right? Essentially, we see that he doesn't get chosen, and he just gets to walk off the stage. Now, could you imagine just being the guy who led the mob, murdered some people, and all of a sudden you're standing on a stage next to a guy who's fed thousands of people, and you just got chosen? So he walks off of this stage having the crowd just chanted his name like, my boys are back. Like, the people love me. And here Jesus gets led away. And now not knowing anything that happens to Barabbas after, it would be easy to assume that, man, this just was a moment where Barabbas walked free, where he should have died and Jesus died instead. And he was like, I'm good. Like, I'm all right. But there's something about Barabbas that Jesus knew that even Barabbas himself didn't know. See, Jesus knew the Father was going to have to treat Jesus like Barabbas so that he could treat Barabbas like Jesus. And just like with Judas and just like with Peter, man, I realize Barabbas lives in me. Because there's days that I take for granted. There's days where I wake up and I don't even consider the fact that I'm still alive, that I've got another day, that there's breath filling my lungs right now for reasons I don't even understand. There's moments where I take my wife and my kids for granted. There's moments where I take where we live for granted. I haven't even been here that long, right? There's moments where all of that will happen, and yet, man, if I'm honest, even as a pastor, there's moments where I take my relationship with Jesus for granted. There's moments where I don't want to say I forget, but there's moments where I fail to recognize the power every day that God himself put him on the planet and died the death I should have died so I could live the life that he should have been able to live. And there's moments where I miss that. And we could say like, oh man, we just get to go free. We just get to go, oh man. Here's the reality. When you and I respond like that, no one went free here. J.I. Packer, an author, he says it like this. He says, our sins have been punished. The wheel of retribution has been turned. Judgment has been inflicted for our ungodliness. But on Jesus, the Lamb of God, who is standing in our place. See, the final character in this story is me. And the final character in this story is you. And we're going to have to make a decision for ourselves when we could point the finger at everybody else and say, I would never do that. Man, I recognize that every one of those three fingers points right back at me and says, I already have. And if it's been true about Judas, if it's been true about Peter, if it's been true about Barabbas, Jesus knew that the Father would have to treat Jesus like me so he could treat me like Jesus. Romans 4:25 says it like this. It says, he has been handed over to die because of our sins, and he was raised to life to make us right with God. Man, have you been sold out? Have you been a sellout? Jesus knows what that's like, and he stood in our place. Man, have you denied somebody? Have you been denied? Jesus knows what that's like, and he stood in our place. Have you taken days for granted? Have you had moments where you've just ignored the implications of right now? Man, Jesus knows what that's like, and he stood in our place. And he gives us the opportunity today for each one of us to be able to say, I'm not going to do that anymore, but because he gave his life for me and stood in my place, that I'm going to take a stand for him. And so if it's true for them, here's one of the ways that I think that we could potentially respond today. There's some of you in the room who this is your first time walking into a church, or maybe this is a first time in a long time. And the way that you could respond today is that you just want to say yes to Jesus. You could be saying yes to the first time, to the God who laid his life down for you. Or you could be saying, man, my relationship with God has been fractured, and today's a comeback for me. My relationship with Jesus is starting fresh and new. We're going to invite you to say yes to that. For some of you today, like you're walking into the room and you can feel the guilt and the shame of having sold out. Or you can feel the hurt and the pain of having been sold out. And you could trust Jesus himself, who knows what that's like and knows what it is. And you could say yes to, man, I've been there and I've done that and I know what it feels, and to let Jesus stand in your place. You could have denied someone, or you could have been denied. You could deny your relationship with Jesus, and today you could, just like Peter, say, but I'm not gonna live like that anymore. That I'm gonna stand, that I'm gonna gladly lay my life down and let the light of Jesus shine out of me. That you could say that today. And then the last yes we're gonna give you an opportunity for today is maybe you've walked away. Maybe you've taken advantage of days. Maybe you've forgotten the implications of even today, but you're like, man, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to remember the power today, and I want to remember the sacrifice of Jesus today. And we're going to give you an opportunity to say yes there. So if you could stand to your feet today, we're going to take a moment where we reflect and we respond. And so as you stand up, here's what I'm going to invite you to do. I'm going to invite you to bow your head. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. There's nothing magical about this. There's nothing even supernatural about this movement, as much as for each one of us just to have a second where we pause and we reflect on what we've heard today. So as you stand up, as you bow your head, as you close your eyes, I just want you to think, man, where are the ways that you've pointed the finger, and what are the ways that they're pointing back at you today? And if you're in the room and you're saying, man, I've never said yes to Jesus before, or maybe you're walking in and saying, man, it's been a while, but I know Jesus and I are back, and you want to say yes to Jesus today, could you lift your hand up real high, because I want to be able to pray for you. So if you're saying yes to Jesus this morning, go ahead and lift your hand up real high. Yeah, thank you so much to those of you who are lifting your hands. Thank you so much. To the second group of people, if you say, man, I've been a sellout, or I've sold some people out. Man, I feel like I've been sold out. And you're carrying the guilt and the shame of that, and you're just saying, man, I want to be free of that today. Could you lift your hand up real high, because I want to be able to pray for you. So if you're saying, man, I'm just bearing guilt and shame around some of those decisions where I've sold out, go ahead and lift your hands up real high. Yeah, thank you so much to those of you who are lifting your hands up. Thank you. If you're saying you've denied a relationship with somebody, or maybe you've denied your relationship with Jesus, and you're saying, man, today I'm going to make a stand for that. Today I'm going to stand up where I've backed away in the past. Could you lift your hand up real high for me too? So if you're saying, man, I've just denied, and today I'm ready to make a stand. Yeah, thank you so much for lifting your hands up. Thank you. And so the last group of people, you're saying, I've been taking some days for granted. I've been taking my family for granted. I've been taking where I'm at and where I live and what's happened in my life. I've been taking that for granted. Or maybe you're saying, man, I've been taking for granted that God himself died in my place, and I want to remember him today. Could you go ahead and lift your hand up real high, because we're going to pray for you too. Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's pray together, and we'll call it a morning. Jesus, today I want to thank you so much that you stood in our place, that you took all the things that we deserved upon yourself. You took our guilt, you took our shame, you took the ways in which we've sold out and the ways we've been sold out. God, you took the moments where we take things for granted, and you've given us freely grace, God. And I pray today, Jesus, that every one of us would remember the most important moment in human history. And God himself suffered on a cross and died in our place so that we could live. And I pray today, God, that the very same Spirit of Jesus that raised him from the dead would be the same Spirit of God that lives inside each one of us and empowers us to live the life we should live, to live our lives fully to God. And I pray, Jesus, for every one of us today, that we'd be marked by the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. Amen. If you said yes to Jesus in any way today, we've got this card available for you in your bulletin. There's a kiosk out in the plaza. We'd love to connect with you and help pray with you or help you take next steps. Thanks so much. Thanks for being here today. We love you. Happy Thanksgiving.